Now let's talk about event handling in jQuery. By now you should be familiar with basic event handling using an HTML attribute like onClick equals my function. Okay, that's event handling a click event using an HTML attribute. And you should know by now that there are plenty of other versions on scroll, on mouse over, on mouse leave, on key up, key down, etc., etc., etc. There are plenty of events that can be listened for in the document object model, in the DOM. So HTML attributes are one way you should be familiar with, and another should be with the .add event listener method. This is where we're going to listen for a click event and run a function which does stuff. Okay? That's the add event listener method for listening for or handling an event on an HTML element. Okay, this is vanilla JavaScript right there. And actually, this is the exact equivalent to this. This is the vanilla JavaScript equivalent to this. Okay, let me get rid of that. So we've seen .click. .click is a very convenient way to handle a click event. However, let's say that you didn't know that .click was its own function, and you still wanted to handle a click event. Well, you could look it up, you could read the jQuery documentation, but there is another catch-all method in jQuery, which is even easier. It's called .on. And it works very similarly to add event listener. So this is on click, run this function. And we can test this out and see it in action. It still works. Okay? So we can simply sub in on click, on mouse leave. Let's try that. So I hover my mouse over, and when I pull it away, it changes. That's mouse leave. Mouse enter. Okay, so .on is one catch-all event handler method for jQuery that is very, very good to know. Notice that it takes two arguments. The first is the event that it should be listening for, and the second is the function which it should invoke when it hears that event. Okay, nevertheless, .click is very, very common, and I would venture to say that click is one of the most common events you're going to be using on all of your web pages ever. So .click as its own function is still worth knowing. It's very, very simple and straightforward. But let's say we wanted this style change to take effect on hover. Okay, hover effects are great. They can really up the professional quality of a website very easily. So let's say we wanted to do this style effect on hover. I'm going to change .click to .hover, which is yet again its own custom method in jQuery. And let's see if that works. I hover and it changes. Great. What you should notice though is it does not change back when I hover off of this H1. When I hover off of the element. So it doesn't behave the way we might expect from hover effects in CSS. In order to make it do so, we're going to need to incorporate a callback function into this .hover method. What that means is .hover actually can take two arguments. The first is going to be the function it invokes when you hover over it, and the second is going to be the function it invokes when you hover off. So if I wanted to reset these CSS changes when I hover off, a couple ways I could do that. One would be to just copy all of this code and change all of these to empty values, or empty strings specifically. Hover over, hover off, hover over, hover off. So when I hover off, the values of these properties in the style attribute disappear. Okay, so that's a callback function in jQuery, and this is very commonly how to handle the .hover method in jQuery. Students often have trouble using .hover to achieve exactly the effect they want because they are unaware that .hover takes a callback function which resets all of this. Something else I want you to keep in mind when exploring hover effects with jQuery is you might ask yourself, well, I can just do this in my CSS, can't I? I could, let's bring back new style. I could always just say h1 : hover, color white, background color purple, text transform lowercase. And that will work. Let me go ahead and comment out my JS. And that still works. It works great. It arguably works even better because it's much less code, right? That's totally true. But can you achieve this same effect, these style changes, on the H1 if I, say, hover over this paragraph? Can you do something like paragraph hover and somehow select the H1 sibling that it has? There is something called a sibling selector in CSS, but this is not going to work. I'll tell you right now, it's not going to work. Sibling selectors will only select siblings which are ahead of that element in its position in HTML. Don't worry about that. You can look more into that on your own if you'd like. Point is, you cannot, using CSS, cause a style change in this H1 as a result of a hover over this paragraph. But you can with jQuery. So let's change my target up here to paragraph. When I hover over my paragraph, I want my H1's CSS to change to this. And here's my callback function, which again resets the CSS changes on the H1 target. Let's see if that works. I hover over my paragraph and it changes. Okay, so this is a very effective way of creating, say, menu animations or list animations. Maybe if you have a list somewhere, you hover over one list item and all the other list items get lighter in color. So it immediately gives some visual feedback to the user as to which list item they're focused on. Think about that. That's one very effective use of jQuery's hover function. Okay? So to recap, .hover, .click are two very useful functions to know. .hover takes two arguments, one function which it invokes on hover, and another function which it invokes off hover. Okay, so that's important. And there is, of course, the .on method for jQuery, which also takes two arguments. First is the event, like click or hover or scroll. Second is the function which it invokes on that event. Okay? Last thing I want to touch on here is, let's bring this back to our H1. So now I hover on the H1 and it does its thing. There's one more bit of refactoring that we can do here to make our code a little bit more efficient. And let me show you what that might look like and why we might care. I'm going to create 3 different H1s. Not going to change my selectors in my jQuery. Reload. Now look at that. When I hover over any one of these H1s, they all change styles. But maybe I only want the one on which I'm hovering to change. This is one of those scenarios where the this variable is critical. I could, of course, give each of these H1s a different class and a different ID and write this function 3 different times for each H1, but that is awful. That is terrible. Instead, what's even easier is to simply replace the selector on these internal functions with this. And what this is going to refer to here is specifically the H1 which we're hovering on. Let's give it a try. Look at that. Okay? So if you ever want to initiate a hover effect on list items in an unordered list, this is a much easier way, no pun intended, this is a much easier way to achieve that effect without having to give each one of your list items a specific ID or class name. Okay, so that's just a very introductory example of why the this variable can come in handy as a selector, not just in jQuery, but in JavaScript in general.